Chapter 1: The Arrival. Matt Carson's fingers drummed impatiently on the steering wheel as his car rattled along the uneven dirt road. The sun was setting, casting long, skeletal shadows through the dense trees. He glanced at the GPS, its screen flickering as it struggled to maintain a signal in the remote wilderness. A solitary cabin icon blinked at him, signaling that his destination was close. Just a few more miles, he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. It had been months since he had written anything substantial. The idea of a secluded cabin in the woods, far from the distractions of city life, had seemed like a perfect solution to his writer's block. Now, as twilight deepened, a shiver of doubt crept over him. When the cabin finally came into view, Matt felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. The structure was old, with weathered wooden planks and a sagging roof that suggested years of neglect. But there was a rustic charm to it, a sense of history that he hoped would ignite his creativity. He parked the car and stepped out, stretching his legs and breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. As he approached the front door, it creaked open slightly, as if inviting him inside. "Hello," Matt called out, his voice echoing through the dim interior. No answer. He pushed the door open wider and stepped over the threshold. The cabin's interior was sparse but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a stack of firewood neatly piled beside it. A battered leather armchair sat in one corner, and a wooden desk with a rickety chair occupied another. Dust motes floated in the last rays of sunlight that streamed through the dirty windows. Matt set his bags down and took a deep breath. "This will do," he said, trying to convince himself. He unpacked quickly, setting up his laptop on the desk and lighting a fire to ward off the evening chill. As the flames crackled to life, casting dancing shadows across the room, he settled into the armchair with a notebook in hand. Hours passed as he stared at the blank pages, frustration mounting. Outside, the forest grew darker, the sounds of nocturnal creatures adding to the cabin's isolation. Just as he was about to give up and turn in for the night, a faint sound caught his attention. It was a whisper, barely audible, like the sigh of a distant wind. Matt froze, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until it seemed to fill the room. "Help me." Matt's heart pounded in his chest. He looked around, but the cabin was empty. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. He stood up, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. There was no response, only silence. Matt shook his head, trying to shake off the eerie sensation. It was just his imagination, he told himself, the stress of writer's block playing tricks on his mind. Determined to get some rest, he extinguished the fire and made his way to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. The bed was old and creaky, but it would do. He lay down, pulling the thin blanket over himself, and closed his eyes. Sleep came fitfully, filled with strange, fragmented dreams. He saw glimpses of shadowy figures, heard the same whispering voice calling out to him. He woke several times in a cold sweat, the sense of unease growing stronger. Just before dawn, he awoke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving around inside the cabin. Matt sat up, his pulse racing. He reached for the flashlight on the bedside table and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. He crept out of the bedroom, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The main room was empty, but the front door was ajar, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Matt swallowed hard, his breath visible in the cold air. "Hello?" he called out again, stepping outside. The forest was shrouded in early morning mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels. There was no sign of anyone. As he turned to go back inside, something on the doorframe caught his eye. Scratched into the wood, barely visible, were the words, "Help me." Matt's blood ran cold. This was no figment of his imagination. Someone had been here, someone desperate enough to leave a message. He knew then that his retreat to the cabin would be anything but peaceful. But amidst the fear, a spark of curiosity flared. Who was the whispering voice? What had happened in this lonely cabin? For the first time in months, Matt felt a flicker of inspiration. His writer's block was cracking, chipped away by the mystery that surrounded him. He was scared, but he was also intrigued, and that was enough to keep him here, to unravel the secrets of the haunted cabin and help the restless spirit find peace. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the forest, Matt returned to his desk. His hands shook as he opened his notebook, but his mind was alive with ideas. He would stay, face his fears, and write. And maybe, just maybe, he would discover the truth hidden within the shadows. Chapter 2: Unearthly Discoveries. Matt spent the morning pacing the cabin, his mind a whirl of questions and half-formed theories. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck that made him glance over his shoulder repeatedly. The daylight did little to dispel the unease that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. He decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly, hoping to find some clue about the mysterious whispering voice and the scratched message. The living room and bedroom had revealed nothing new, so he turned his attention to the small kitchen. It was a simple setup: an old gas stove, a few cabinets, and a rickety table with two mismatched chairs. He rummaged through the cabinets, finding nothing but cobwebs and a few rusted utensils. Next, he examined the fireplace. The stone structure was large and imposing, its hearth cold and dark now that the fire had burned out. He ran his fingers along the mantel, feeling for any hidden compartments or loose stones. Nothing. Frustrated, he stood back and stared at the fireplace, his mind racing. The voice had seemed so real, so desperate. There had to be something he was missing. He was about to give up when he noticed a faint outline in the soot-streaked stones. It was a small door, barely visible and cleverly disguised to blend in with the rest of the fireplace. Matt's heart quickened as he pried it open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. He hesitated only for a moment before grabbing the flashlight and squeezing into the passage. The air inside was cold and musty, and the beam of light barely penetrated the thick darkness. He moved slowly, the floorboards creaking ominously underfoot. The passage led to a hidden room, no larger than a closet. Inside, he found an old wooden chest, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. He knelt down and carefully lifted the lid, revealing a collection of yellowed papers and faded photographs. Matt's hands trembled as he picked up the topmost paper. It was a letter written in a neat, elegant script. The date at the top was from decades ago. He began to read. "Dearest Margaret, I fear my time is running short. The entity that haunts this place grows stronger with each passing day. I've tried to understand its pain, to help it find peace, but it resists my efforts. If you are reading this, know that I loved you with all my heart. Forgive me for what I must do. Yours forever, Edward." The letter slipped from Matt's fingers as a chill ran down his spine. Edward, Margaret. The names echoed in his mind, conjuring images of a tragic love story intertwined with supernatural forces. He sifted through the rest of the papers, finding more letters, journal entries, and sketches. They painted a picture of Edward, a man tormented by the presence in the cabin, and Margaret, his beloved, whom he had left behind to confront the entity alone. Matt's breath caught as he uncovered a photograph at the bottom of the chest. It showed a young couple standing in front of the cabin, their faces alight with happiness. Edward and Margaret. But behind them, barely visible, was a shadowy figure, its features obscured, but its eyes gleaming with malevolence. He shoved the photograph and papers into his backpack, his mind buzzing with questions. Who or what was the entity that haunted this place? What had happened to Edward and Margaret, and why had the voice called out to him asking for help? Determined to find answers, Matt left the hidden room and returned to the main cabin. The daylight had faded, and the forest outside was shrouded in twilight. He made a quick meal, barely tasting the food as he ate, his thoughts consumed by the mystery. As night fell, he sat at the desk, the journal entries spread out before him. He lit a candle, its flickering flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. The whispering voice had been silent all day, but he knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. Matt picked up his pen and began to write, the words flowing effortlessly for the first time in months. He wrote about Edward and Margaret, about the love that had driven Edward to confront the supernatural forces within the cabin. He wrote about the shadowy figure in the photograph, its eyes filled with a hatred that seemed to transcend time. Hours passed as he lost himself in the story, the world outside fading away. It was only when the candle burned low and the fire had died down that he realized how late it was. He yawned, exhaustion finally catching up with him. As he prepared for bed, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. The cabin held secrets, dark and terrifying, but they were secrets that called to him, that begged to be uncovered. He climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin, and closed his eyes. The whispering started almost immediately. "Help me," it pleaded, the voice filled with a sorrow that tugged at Matt's heart. He listened, not with fear this time, but with a growing resolve. "I will," he whispered back into the darkness. "I promise." And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that the haunted cabin had become more than just a place to overcome his writer's block. It had become his story, his purpose, and he would do whatever it took to uncover the truth and help the restless spirit find peace. Chapter 3: The First Encounter. The next morning, Matt woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear that had gripped him the previous night had not dissipated, but it was now tempered by curiosity and a determination to solve the mystery. He spent a few hours organizing the letters and journal entries, piecing together Edward's tragic tale. It was clear that Edward had been a man deeply in love and equally tormented by the presence in the cabin. Matt decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping to find more clues about the cabin's past. He grabbed his backpack, stuffed it with the journal entries and some snacks, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the previous night. As he ventured deeper into the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the trees, expecting to see the shadowy figure from the photograph lurking in the underbrush, but there was nothing. Just the peaceful, indifferent wilderness. After about an hour of walking, Matt stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, weathered stone well. Its stones were covered in moss, and the wooden cover had rotted away long ago. He approached it cautiously, peering down into the darkness. The well seemed to go on forever, the bottom lost in shadow. Something about the well felt significant. He retrieved a small flashlight from his backpack and shone it down, but the light barely penetrated the gloom. He picked up a stone and dropped it in, counting the seconds until he heard a faint splash. "Interesting," he muttered to himself. The well was deep, possibly connected to underground water sources or caverns. He made a mental note to return with more equipment, maybe even some rope, to explore it further. As he turned to leave, he noticed something half buried in the dirt near the well. He knelt down and brushed away the earth, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. His heart raced as he lifted it, the wood cool and smooth under his fingers. It had no lock, and he opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate necklace, a locket on a fine silver chain. He opened the locket to find a tiny, faded photograph of Edward and Margaret, their faces youthful and happy. Beneath the locket was a folded piece of parchment. He unfolded it gently, revealing a hand-drawn map of the area around the cabin, with several points marked. "Looks like a treasure map," Matt said, excitement bubbling up inside him. The map showed the cabin, the well, and several other locations that might hold clues to Edward and Margaret's story. He spent the rest of the day following the map, discovering hidden spots and small artifacts that hinted at the cabin's history. An old tree with initials carved into its trunk, a rusted iron gate leading to a long abandoned garden, and a stone bench covered in ivy. Each discovery added a piece to the puzzle, but it also raised more questions. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun was setting and a sense of foreboding settled over him once more. He made a quick dinner, his mind racing with the day's findings. He spread the map out on the desk, marking the places he had visited and planning his next steps. As darkness fell, the cabin grew cold and the shadows deepened. Matt lit a fire in the fireplace, the warmth and light providing some comfort. He sat in the armchair, reading through the journal entries again, looking for any mention of the locations he had discovered. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped and the fire flickered ominously. Matt looked up, his breath visible in the icy air. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the room with its mournful plea. "Help me." Matt stood, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice shaking. The whispering grew more urgent, and the air around him seemed to thicken. He felt a presence, cold and oppressive, pressing down on him. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly. "Show yourself," Matt demanded, a mixture of fear and defiance in his voice. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the cabin fell into an eerie silence. Matt scanned the room but saw nothing. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize near the fireplace. It was translucent, its edges shimmering like heat waves. The figure was that of a man, his face twisted in anguish. "Edward?" Matt whispered, his throat dry. The figure nodded slowly, its eyes filled with sorrow. It raised a hand, pointing towards the desk. Matt followed the gesture and saw that one of the journal entries had been moved, a particular passage highlighted by a flickering candle. He picked up the paper and read, "I fear the entity that haunts this place is beyond my understanding. It is not merely a restless spirit, but something darker, something ancient. I have discovered a ritual that may banish it, but it requires great sacrifice. If I fail, may whoever finds this place have the courage to finish what I could not." Matt looked up, meeting Edward's gaze. The figure's eyes were pleading, desperate. "I'll help you," Matt said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'll finish what you started." The figure of Edward began to fade, his expression one of gratitude and relief. As he disappeared, the temperature in the room rose and the oppressive feeling lifted. The whispering ceased, leaving Matt alone with his thoughts. He sat back down at the desk, the journal entry clutched in his hand. The ritual Edward had mentioned was his only lead, his only hope of solving the mystery and freeing the spirit trapped in the cabin. Determined, Matt began to write, documenting everything he had discovered and planning his next steps. He would need to research the ritual, gather the necessary materials, and brace himself for whatever lay ahead. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Matt felt a strange sense of calm. The cabin was haunted, yes, but it was also filled with stories waiting to be told. And for the first time in a long time, he felt alive with purpose. The adventure had begun, and there was no turning back.
Hey, adventurers! Looking for your next epic tabletop game night? Let me introduce you to Quest Island, a card-based adventure where you and your friends team up to conquer dungeons, slay enemies, and complete epic quests. It's perfect for D&D lovers who want to jump straight into the action. No session zero required. Build your island, choose your hero, and roll the dice for glory. Want to grab your copy and start your adventure? Head over to palfreygames.ca. That's palfreygames.ca. Your next great quest is just a click away.
Chapter 4, The Ritual. Matt spent the next few days immersed in research, poring over Edward's journal entries and scouring the local library for any information on ancient rituals and hauntings. The more he read, the more he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a simple ghost story. It was a deeply rooted supernatural mystery that spanned decades. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest outside the cabin turned into a sea of shadows, Matt spread out all his findings on the desk. He lit several candles to combat the growing darkness and started piecing together the fragments of Edward's notes and other references he had found. The ritual Edward mentioned was an old, complex one, dating back to ancient times. It required specific items and precise actions, and failure to perform it correctly could have dire consequences. Matt felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but he also felt a growing determination to see it through. He made a list of the items he needed: a silver dagger, a black candle, an amulet of protection, and a vial of blessed water. Some of these things he could source from local shops or order online, but others would require more effort to find. Matt decided to start with the black candle and the amulet of protection, hoping he could find a local store that specialized in esoteric or occult items. He drove into the nearest town and asked around, eventually being directed to a small, out-of-the-way shop called the Enchanted Grove. The shop was tucked away in a narrow alley, its front window filled with crystals, herbs, and other mystical items. A small bell tinkled as Matt pushed open the door, and he was greeted by the scent of incense and the soft glow of candlelight. The shop was cluttered but cozy, with shelves filled with an eclectic mix of items. "Hello," Matt called out, and a woman emerged from behind a beaded curtain. She was in her 50s, with long silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through him. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but firm. "What can I help you with?" Matt explained his situation, leaving out the more fantastical elements. He simply said he was a writer looking for inspiration and needed some specific items for his research. The woman listened intently, nodding as he spoke. I see," she said once he finished. "You're looking for a black candle and an amulet of protection, correct?" Matt nodded. "Yes, do you have those?" The woman smiled. "I do. Wait here a moment." She disappeared behind the curtain again, and Matt took the opportunity to look around the shop. He was drawn to a display of old books, their spines cracked and titles faded with age. A few minutes later, the woman returned with a small box. She opened it to reveal a beautifully crafted black candle and an intricate silver amulet shaped like a pentagram with protective runes etched around its edges. "These should serve your purpose," she said, handing them to Matt. The candle is infused with herbs and oils that enhance its power, and the amulet has been blessed by a priestess. Matt took them gratefully. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" The woman named a price that was surprisingly reasonable. Matt paid, and as he turned to leave, she spoke again. "Be careful, young man. Whatever you're dealing with, it's powerful. Trust your instincts and stay safe." Matt nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. "I will. Thank you." Back at the cabin, Matt set up the items on desk, their presence both comforting and intimidating. He still needed the silver dagger and the vial of blessed water. He knew the dagger would be the hardest to find, as it had to be crafted in a specific way and blessed by a spiritual leader. The next day, he made a series of calls and visits to antique shops and pawn shops, hoping to find the dagger. It was a frustrating process, filled with dead ends and skeptical looks from shopkeepers. Just as he was about to give up, he walked into a small, unassuming pawn shop on the edge of town. The shop owner, an elderly man with a weathered face and kind eyes, listened to Matt's request without judgment. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a dusty wooden box. Inside was a beautiful silver dagger, its blade gleaming even in the dim light of the shop. "This was brought to me years ago," the owner said. "I don't know much about it, but I can tell it's special. You can have it, if you promise to take care of it." Matt felt a surge of gratitude. "I promise. Thank you." With the dagger secured, Matt returned to the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. He now had all the items except for the blessed water. He decided to visit the local church the next morning, hoping to get the water blessed by the priest. The church was a small, quaint building nestled in the heart of the town. Matt walked inside, the smell of old wood and incense filling his senses. He approached the priest, a middle-aged man with a warm smile. "Father, I need a favor," Matt said, explaining that he needed some water blessed for a personal project. The priest raised an eyebrow but agreed without hesitation. He blessed the water and Matt thanked him profusely. Back at the cabin, Matt laid out all the items on the desk: the black candle, the amulet, the silver dagger, and the vial of blessed water. Everything was ready. Now he just needed to understand the exact steps of the ritual and gather his courage. He spent the rest of the day studying Edward's notes, meticulously planning each step. As night fell, the familiar sense of unease returned, but Matt felt more prepared. He knew that whatever happened, he had to see this through. For Edward, for Margaret, and for the spirit trapped in the cabin. He lit the black candle and placed the amulet around his neck. He drew a protective circle on the floor with salt as described in Edward's notes and stood in the center, the dagger in one hand and the vial of blessed water in the other. Taking a deep breath, Matt began to recite the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The air around him seemed to thrum with energy, the candle's flame flickering wildly. He felt a presence, cold and oppressive, pressing in on him. Suddenly, the whispering began again, louder and more desperate than ever. "Help me." Matt's voice grew stronger as he continued the incantation, the words flowing from him with a power he didn't know he possessed. The presence grew stronger, and he could see a figure taking shape before him, its face twisted in anguish. He raised the dagger and poured the blessed water over the blade, the liquid hissing as it touched the silver. The figure recoiled, but Matt didn't falter. He thrust the dagger into the ground, completing the ritual. For a moment, everything was still. Then a powerful gust of wind swept through the cabin, extinguishing the candle and knocking Matt to the floor. He looked up to see the figure fading, its features softening. It was Edward, his expression one of peace and gratitude. "Thank you," Edward whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "You freed us." And with that, he was gone, the oppressive presence lifting. The cabin was silent, the air clear and calm. Matt lay on the floor, exhausted but victorious. He had done it. He had completed the ritual and freed the spirits trapped in the cabin. As he got to his feet, a sense of profound relief washed over him. The mystery was solved, the spirits at peace. And for the first time in a long time, Matt felt a deep sense of accomplishment and purpose. He knew there was still more to uncover, more stories to tell, but for now, he was content. The adventure had been worth it, and he had found not only a story, but also a new sense of direction in his life. Matt sat down at the desk, picked up his pen, and began to write. Chapter 5, Echoes of the Past. After the intensity of the ritual and the dramatic departure of Edward's spirit, the cabin felt profoundly different, lighter somehow, and less burdened. Matt woke the next morning with a clear mind, the fear that had gripped him so tightly now just a memory. The cabin, which had once felt oppressive and haunted, now seemed merely an old building with a lot of character and history. Despite the resolution of the haunting, the writer in Matt was still intrigued by the unanswered questions about the cabin's past. He knew there were more stories nestled within these walls, secrets that might not be as malevolent as the spirit of Edward, but were no less captivating. With this renewed curiosity, Matt decided to spend the day exploring the cabin further, particularly the attic, which he had avoided until now due to its dilapidated condition and the general eeriness that seemed to permeate the upper floor. He retrieved a sturdy ladder from the shed outside and positioned it under the hatch that led to the attic. With a deep breath and a flicker of the old trepidation, he ascended, pushing open the hatch. Dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he poked his head through the opening. The attic was cluttered with furniture covered in white sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and old trunks that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and must. As Matt climbed fully into the attic, his flashlight swept across the room, illuminating a large portrait that was turned against the wall. Curious, he approached and carefully turned the portrait around. It was a painting of a stern-looking man with piercing eyes, dressed in the fashion of the late 1800s. Matt felt a chill as he considered the possibility that this was the original owner of the cabin, perhaps even a relative or ancestor of Edward. Next to the portrait, he found a leather-bound journal, much older and more delicate than Edward's. He opened it gently, finding the entries were dated back to the turn of the century. The handwriting was elegant but difficult to read, and the language used was formal, indicative of a different era. Matt spent hours in the attic, reading the journal and sifting through the boxes. He discovered old letters, more photographs, and documents that charted the life of the cabin over generations. It became clear that the cabin had been a family retreat, handed down through the ages, each generation adding their own stories and experiences to the fabric of the building. As dusk approached, Matt took a break, sitting back against an old trunk, the journal in his lap. The stories he had uncovered were fascinating, tales of joy, sadness, and everyday life that were so different yet so similar to his own experiences. He realized that in focusing on the supernatural, he had almost missed the human stories, the real essence of the cabin. Determined to preserve these stories, Matt decided to write a book, not just about the haunting and the ritual, but about the cabin itself. He would tell the tale of Edward and Margaret, but also the stories of all those who had lived in or visited the cabin. It would be a narrative of a place as much as the people, a chronicle of the cabin's life through the ages. That night, Matt started to outline the chapters, his excitement growing with each story he planned to tell. He set up a workspace in the attic among the artifacts of the cabin's past, feeling more connected to the project than anything he had worked on before. As he worked late into the night, the cabin around him felt peaceful, almost approving. The fear that had driven his early days here was gone. replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose. The whispers and shadows were now just part of the story, elements of the past that would help him tell a richer, fuller tale. In that quiet, solitary environment, Matt wrote with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. The stories flowed from him effortlessly, as if they were eager to be told, to be remembered. And as he wrote, he felt a profound connection, not just to the cabin and its past inhabitants, but to his own craft and creativity. The cabin had indeed cured his writer's block, but it had given him much more than that. It had given him a new story to tell, one that intertwined the lives of many and spanned several generations. In the calm that follows a long night of writing, Matt knew that this experience would change his writing forever, infusing it with new depth and empathy. The haunted cabin in the woods had turned out to be his muse, and he was grateful for every whisper and shadow that had led him here. Chapter 6: Whispers in the Wind. With a clear direction for his book and a treasure trove of stories to draw from, Matt dedicated himself to the task of writing. Each morning, he awoke with a sense of purpose, eager to translate the whispers of the past into the written word. The once ominous solitude of the cabin had become his sanctuary, a place where history spoke directly to him. As he delved deeper into the history of the cabin, Matt decided to visit the local historical society to see if he could uncover more about the land and the people who had lived there before Edward's family. The society was located in the heart of the nearest town, housed in a charming old building that was as much a relic as the artifacts it preserved. The archivist, a woman named Clara, was a fount of knowledge and eager to assist when Matt explained his project. She led him through rows of file cabinets and shelves laden with books, pulling out maps and photographs that showed the cabin and its surroundings through the years. "You know, there's an old legend about that place," Clara said as she laid out a particularly old map on the table. "They say it was built on land that was sacred to the local indigenous tribe. Supposedly, the area is a thin place where the veil between worlds is thinner." Matt's interest was piqued. "Do you think that has something to do with the hauntings?" Clara shrugged. "It's hard to say, but many of the stories about that cabin have a supernatural element. It seems to attract events." Armed with copies of historical documents and a head full of new theories, Matt returned to the cabin. The idea that the land itself could contribute to the phenomena he'd experienced added a new layer to his story. He spent the next few days outlining a chapter that explored the land's history and its spiritual significance. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace jotting down notes, a sudden gust of wind swept down the chimney, scattering his papers into the air. As he gathered them, a sheet of old parchment, which he didn't recognize, floated towards him. Picking it up, he realized it was a hand-drawn map of the cabin and its immediate surroundings, but it included several landmarks that he had never noticed. Curious, Matt decided to follow the map the next day. Each landmark was a revelation: a hidden grove with carvings on the trees, a small pond that reflected the sky perfectly clear, and a crumbling stone altar that seemed to hum with an old power. Each place felt alive, as if echoing with the footsteps of those who had come before him. As he stood by the stone altar, the air vibrated with a whispered chant that seemed to arise from the earth itself. Matt recorded everything, using his phone to capture sounds and his notebook to sketch quick impressions and jot down his feelings. That night, back at the cabin, the wind rose again, howling around the eaves as if carrying voices. Matt listened, trying to discern words or meanings in the cacophony. The idea came to him then. These atmospheric elements were not just disturbances, but communications, attempts by the past to be heard. Inspired, Matt began writing a chapter on the natural phenomena around the cabin, framing them as manifestations of the land's memory. He wrote about the way the wind seemed to carry voices, the reflective pond that showed more than just one's own image, and the grove with its carved trees that whispered secrets of old. Days turned into weeks, and Matt's initial fear was replaced by a profound connection to the cabin and its surroundings. His writing flourished, each chapter weaving together personal experiences, historical facts, and local legends. The cabin, with its quirks and whispers, had become more than a setting for his book. It was a character in its own right, full of stories and secrets. One afternoon, as he transcribed an old letter he found hidden within a wall during his renovations, Matt realized how deeply he had changed. The cabin had not only given him stories, but had also taught him to listen to the wind, the woods, and the walls. His book was no longer just about a haunted cabin. It was a meditation on the ways places hold and shape memories, both human and supernatural. As he prepared for another evening of writing, Matt felt a contentment he hadn't known in years. The cabin, once a place of fear and mystery, was now his home, a place where the past met the present, speaking in whispers that only he could hear. Chapter 7: Ties That Bind. With his book taking shape and the initial chapters fleshed out, Matt felt compelled to delve deeper into the personal histories of those who had lived in the cabin before him. He knew the supernatural elements and ancient land lore were captivating, but it was the human stories that truly tethered the soul of his narrative to the heart. Determined to bring these personal stories to light, Matt revisited the attic, intent on uncovering more about the people in the faded photographs and the names in the journals. Each box and trunk he opened seemed to whisper secrets of joy and despair, life and death, love and loss. Among the dusty archives, he discovered a collection of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. The handwriting was graceful, almost artistic, belonging to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the cabin during the early 1940s. Her letters were addressed to a soldier named Thomas, and through her words, Matt pieced together a poignant love story set against the backdrop of World War II. Eleanor's letters began with everyday happenings and local gossip, but as the months passed and the war dragged on, her words grew more intimate, reflecting her fears and longings. She wrote about waiting for Thomas, about how the cabin felt empty without his laughter, and how she found solace in the woods that surrounded their home. As Matt read, he could almost feel Eleanor's presence in the room with him, her spirit imbued in the very fabric of the cabin. He decided then that her story deserved a chapter of its own. Her letters not only provided a glimpse into the life of a woman during wartime, but also illustrated how the cabin served as a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. With Eleanor's story firmly in mind, Matt explored further, discovering more about the cabin's role through the decades. It had been a summer retreat, a honeymoon spot, a solitary writer's haven, and even a hidden speakeasy during Prohibition. Each era added layers to the cabin's story, each occupant leaving behind echoes of their existence. His research took him outside the confines of the cabin once more, this time to the local cemetery. There, he found the resting places of some of the cabin's previous owners and visitors. The gravestones, weathered and moss-covered, were like bookmarks in the pages of history, each one marking a story that had unfolded in the cabin. Matt spent hours in the cemetery, sketching the gravestones and jotting down names and dates. He felt a responsibility to these people, a duty to tell their stories with respect and care. Back at the cabin, he laid out the information, connecting families and stories, drawing a timeline that spanned nearly a century. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the trees, Matt realized how interconnected the stories were. The cabin wasn't just a backdrop to these lives. It was a character in their stories, a silent witness to their joys and sorrows. Inspired by this realization, Matt began to write with renewed vigor. He started with Eleanor's story, using her letters to bring her experiences to life. He described how the war had stretched taut the threads of her emotions, how she poured her fears and dreams into her letters to Thomas. Her words, filled with love and longing, painted a vivid picture of a woman both strong and vulnerable, her spirit a permanent part of the cabin. From Eleanor, he moved to other stories, weaving a tapestry of narratives that captured the essence of each era. The speakeasy chapter was filled with clandestine meetings and whispered secrets, the jazz age music almost audible in his descriptions. The honeymoon stories were sweet and hopeful, each couple leaving a part of their new beginnings within the cabin's walls. As night deepened, Matt worked by the light of his desk lamp, the only sound the scratch of his pen and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The cabin, with all its memories, seemed to approve, its creaks and sighs the accompaniment to his writing. Finally, leaning back in his chair, Matt felt a profound connection to everything the cabin stood for. It was more than just a building, it was a collection of human experiences, a vessel for stories of those who had passed through its doors. Content. Matt knew that his book would not just be a history, but a tribute to the cabin and its inhabitants, a celebration of the ties that bind us to places and to each other. As he closed his notebook for the night, he felt not just satisfaction, but a deep gratitude. The cabin had given him not just a refuge, but a rich tapestry of life to share with the world. Chapter 8: The Hearth's Whisper. As autumn deepened, bringing with it a chill that cloaked the cabin in mists and an eerie quiet, Matt's manuscript grew in depth and complexity. He had laid the groundwork of personal tales and historical intrigue, enriching the narrative with the broader historical context of the region. But now, as the leaves turned fiery and began their descent to the forest floor, a new dimension of the story began to reveal itself. The cabin itself as a crucible of transformation. One brisk morning, with a mug of steaming coffee in hand, Matt walked around the cabin, examining its structure, the aging wood, and the way the morning light played through the cracks in the timbers. He realized he had detailed the lives of the cabin's inhabitants, but he had not yet fully explored how the cabin itself had evolved over the years. Determined to rectify this, he delved back into the attic, searching for architectural plans or any documents that might shed light on the cabin's physical changes. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he found a rolled-up sheaf of parchment, yellowed with age but still legible. They were blueprints, dated back to the early 1900s, showing the original design of the cabin, along with several planned modifications that had never been realized. Intrigued, Matt spread the blueprints out on the floor of the attic. The sun streamed through a small window, illuminating the detailed drawings. It was fascinating to see the architect's vision, a grander, more imposing structure than the modest cabin it had remained. Why the plans had been abandoned, Matt could only guess, but he speculated that financial or familial upheavals might have played a role. He spent the day comparing the blueprints to the current structure, noting the changes that had been made and those that hadn't. The original plan had included an additional wing and a second story, which would have transformed the cozy cabin into a substantial home. Matt walked through the cabin, imagining what it might have looked like, his footsteps echoing slightly in the empty rooms. His exploration led him to appreciate the cabin's current quirks, the way the floors sloped slightly, the creaking of the old wood, and the stone fireplace that seemed too large for such a small living room, but gave it character and warmth. Later that day, Matt sat by the fireplace, the heart of the cabin, with his notes and laptop open before him. He started a new chapter titled The Hearth's Whisper, focusing on the fireplace as a central theme. It had been the literal and metaphorical source of warmth for the cabin's inhabitants, a gathering place where hands were warmed, meals were cooked, and stories were shared. As he wrote, Matt reflected on how the fireplace had also been a silent witness to the cabin's history. It had seen secret rendezvous during the Prohibition era, family reunions, solitary winters, and romantic evenings. It was around this fireplace that Eleanor had likely sat, penning her heartfelt letters to Thomas, the firelight flickering across her anxious face. Matt wove these observations into his narrative, using the fireplace as a metaphor for the cabin's enduring spirit. He described how, despite the changes and challenges over the years, the hearth remained a constant, steadfast element in the life of the cabin, just as it now anchored his daily writing routine. The chapter flowed from him effortlessly, filled with a mix of historical fact, personal reflection, and poetic license. He wrote of imagined conversations that might have taken place by the fire, of decisions made, and of quiet, introspective moments that shaped the lives of those who had called the cabin home. As dusk fell and the fire burned down to embers, Matt felt a profound connection to the story he was telling. The cabin, with all its layers and memories, seemed to come alive around him, its history resonating in every creak and whisper of the wind. Closing his laptop, Matt leaned back in his chair, listening to the quiet sounds of the night settling around the cabin. The chapter on the hearth had not only added a rich layer to his book, but had deepened his own understanding of what the cabin represented: resilience, warmth, and the timeless human need for connection and shelter. With a contented sigh, He added another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and rise. The warmth spread through the room, enveloping him in its comforting embrace, just as it had embraced countless others before him. This, Matt realized, was the true heart of the cabin's story. Chapter 9: A Winter's Tale. As the first snow of winter blanketed the forest, transforming the landscape into a serene expanse of white and muted sounds, Matt settled deeper into the rhythm of life at the cabin. With each passing day, he felt more entwined with its history, each chapter written adding another layer to his connection with the place. With the onset of winter, the cabin became even more isolated. The nearest town was now a slippery, treacherous drive down snow-packed roads, and the days grew shorter, the nights longer, and filled with the deep silence of snowfall. It was in this profound isolation that Matt discovered not just the hardship, but also the enchanting beauty of winter at the cabin. One morning, as he watched the snowflakes drift lazily through the air, he decided to write a chapter titled A Winter's Tale, focusing on how the harsh and beautiful winters had shaped the lives of those who had lived in the cabin before him. He imagined the families huddled around the fireplace, the storm shutters rattling against fierce winds, and the calm that settled over the world outside. As Matt researched, he found anecdotes in the journals about winters past: children born on the coldest nights, stories of animals taking refuge under the cabin's foundations, and tales of mysterious figures seen walking through the snow, perhaps products of cabin fever or echoes of something older, woven into the fabric of the cabin's mythology. One story in particular caught his attention: a winter so fierce it had been termed the Great White Silence in a journal from the late 1800s. The cabin had been cut off for months, and the family residing there had nearly run out of provisions. They had survived on the meager supplies they had, supplemented by whatever game they could catch. The journal described the silent world, the muffled sounds, the blinding whiteness, and the stark beauty of the snow-covered woods. Inspired, Matt ventured outside with his camera to capture the starkness and beauty of the landscape, trying to see the cabin and its surroundings through the eyes of those who had been here in winters past. He trudged through the snow, each step sinking slightly, the cold biting at his cheeks, and he felt a visceral connection to the stories he was telling. Returning to the warmth of the cabin, cheeks flushed and fingers numb, Matt set about writing. He described the heavy snow blanketing everything in sight, the way the trees looked like specters with frosted branches, and how the usual sounds of the forest were swallowed by the thick carpet of snow. He wrote of the solitude and how it could be both oppressive and beautifully serene. In his narrative, Matt explored the psychological effects of such isolation on the cabin's inhabitants. The winter forced introspection and a deeper communion with one's thoughts and fears, much as he was experiencing now. He reflected on how the enforced solitude could lead to profound personal revelations and, in some cases, a rekindling of the spirit, akin to the rebirth that follows the winter thaw. As the chapter unfolded, Matt wove in his own experiences, blending them with historical accounts to create a tapestry of winter tales that felt both timeless and immediate. He wrote late into the night, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional thump of snow falling from an overloaded branch. When he finally paused, leaning back in his chair and stretching his cramped muscles, Matt felt a deep satisfaction. A Winter's Tale was more than just a recounting of past winters. It was a homage to the season's brutal and beautiful duality, a reflection on the human capacity to endure and adapt. Matt knew that each chapter he wrote tethered him more deeply to the cabin. With every story from its past, he was not just the chronicler, but also a participant, adding his own layer to its history. As he added logs to the dying fire and watched the flames leap to life, he felt a comforting sense of belonging. The cabin, with all its stories and silences, was no longer just a retreat, but a home. Chapter 10: The Gathering Storm. As winter deepened, the isolation of the cabin became even more pronounced. The snow lay thick upon the ground, and the trees bore heavy, white coats that muffled the sounds of the forest, turning the world outside into a hushed, wintry cathedral. Matt found himself caught between the serene beauty of his surroundings and the gnawing edge of cabin fever. In his growing restlessness, Matt decided to delve into the cabin's history during turbulent times. He began researching the tumultuous periods that had affected the area, economic depressions, wars, and harsh winters that had tested the resilience of its inhabitants. His focus led him to start a new chapter titled The Gathering Storm, exploring how external crises had seeped into the lives of those within the cabin. He unearthed stories of the Great Depression when the cabin had been a haven for a family that had lost everything. They had moved from a bustling city to the relative seclusion of the cabin, trading financial ruin for the struggle of rural subsistence. The family's patriarch had kept detailed journals during those years, which provided Matt with a rich narrative of survival and adaptation. Matt wove these historical threads into his chapter, depicting the stark contrast between the peaceful snowscape outside and the storm of human hardship. He described how the family had hunted game and gathered what wild edibles they could find, how they had patched the cabin's chinks with moss to keep the wind out, and how they had drawn together in the warmth of the hearth to share stories and support each other. As he wrote, a real storm was brewing outside, a reminder of the harsh conditions he was writing about. The wind began to howl, a foreboding soundtrack to his tapping on the keyboard. Snowflakes whipped against the windows, the sky darkened early, and the temperature dropped, seeping its cold into the bones of the old cabin. Feeling a kinship with the past inhabitants' struggles, Matt lit the fireplace, its glow casting dancing shadows across the room. The crackling of the fire seemed to echo the historical heartbeats of the cabin, each spark a reminder of the resilience it had housed. Engrossed in his writing, Matt detailed a particularly severe winter during the 1940s, when the cabin had sheltered a young couple from the ravages of World War II. The man, a writer like himself, had been drafted but injured early on and sent home. The couple had retreated to the cabin, where they faced the dual storms of recovery and wartime rationing. Their love and fortitude, chronicled through letters exchanged with friends and family who remained in the cities, painted a poignant picture of personal endurance amidst global chaos. Matt's narrative captured the essence of these historical storms, both literal and metaphorical, that had swept through the lives of the cabin's inhabitants. He linked their stories to the current storm raging outside his windows, drawing parallels that underscored the timeless struggle against life's tempests. As he concluded the chapter, the storm outside peaked, the wind shrieking with a ferocity that rattled the windows. Matt paused, looking up from his manuscript to watch nature's display. In that moment, he felt a deep connection not only to the cabin and its past, but also to the wider world, understanding more profoundly how external forces shape our lives. With a sense of accomplishment, he saved his work and stowed his laptop away. He poured himself a hot drink, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and settled by the fire. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the cabin was warm and safe, a timeless sanctuary against the chaos of the world. As the wind's wail modulated to a whisper with the passing of the storm, Matt felt a reflective calm. He realized that his stay in the cabin was not just an escape, but a journey through the layers of human experience, each chapter a step deeper into the understanding of resilience and hope. With this insight, he drifted off to sleep, the embers of the fire waning and the storm's echo a gentle murmur in the background. Shadows of Spring. As winter's fierce grip began to loosen, the first signs of spring whispered through the thawing woods. The snow melted in patches, revealing the dormant earth beneath, and the air carried the scent of wet soil and new growth. Matt watched this transformation from the windows of the cabin, feeling a parallel shift within himself as his book neared completion. In this new chapter, titled Shadows of Spring, Matt explored the symbolic rebirths that the cabin and its inhabitants had experienced over the decades during the spring months. It was a time of renewal, but also of uncovering what the snow had hidden, both literally and metaphorically. One morning, equipped with a notebook and camera, Matt ventured into the woods, his boots sinking into the soft mud. He was in search of the cabin's secret places that were mentioned in the old journals and maps he had found. One such place was a small garden that had been tended by a woman named Abigail in the early 1900s. According to her diary, this garden was her sanctuary, where she planted herbs and flowers that could be seen from the cabin's windows. Following an old, faded map, Matt found the remains of the garden. The wooden fence that once enclosed it was mostly rotted away, and the garden itself was overgrown with wild plants. However, as he cleared away some of the debris, he found shoots of new life, perennials that were beginning to poke through the soil, resilient and vibrant. Inspired by this discovery, Matt decided to restore the garden. It seemed a fitting tribute to the cabin and its past residents, and a peaceful task that complemented his writing. Each day, he would spend a few hours in the garden, clearing, planting, and planning. As his hands worked the soil, he thought about Abigail and the others who had found solace here, and he felt a deep sense of connection to them. Back inside the cabin, Matt wrote about these experiences, interweaving his personal narrative with historical anecdotes. He described the physical and emotional process of uncovering and revitalizing the garden, using it as a metaphor for his own rejuvenation. Just as he brought new life to the garden, the cabin and its stories had revitalized his spirit and creativity. As spring progressed, the days grew longer and warmer, and the garden flourished under Matt's care. He planted herbs like those Abigail had written about, lavender, thyme, and rosemary, and flowers that added color and fragrance. The garden became a living link to the past, a place that blended history with the present. Meanwhile, his manuscript grew as well, each chapter a new layer of history and personal reflection. Writing in the mornings, with the window open to the sounds of birds and the scent of blooming flowers, Matt felt a profound gratitude for the cabin and its endless sources of inspiration. One particularly warm afternoon, while taking a break from writing, Matt wandered to the nearby stream that had just shed its icy winter shell. The water flowed clear and cold, bubbling over rocks and fallen branches. As he sat there, notebook in hand, he reflected on the journey he had taken since arriving at the cabin. The stream, with its constant flow yet ever-changing waters, reminded him of the stories he had unearthed, each connected to the next, always moving, always evolving. He wrote a passage about this, drawing parallels between the stream and the narrative of the cabin, each enduring through the seasons, each telling a story of resilience and renewal. As the shadows of the trees lengthened with the setting sun, Matt felt a contentment that was both deep and uplifting. The cabin had not only provided him with a refuge from his previous life's noise, but had also woven itself into his being, teaching him lessons of patience, continuity, and the beauty of uncovering what lies beneath the surface. With the draft of his book nearly complete, Matt realized that his stay at the cabin was drawing to a close. But as he looked around at the woods, the restored garden, and the flowing stream, he knew that the end of this chapter in his life was just the beginning of another. The cabin, with its deep roots and seasonal transformations, had changed him, and he would carry its stories with him, ready to share them with the world.